Good morning, welcome. 1933, there was a rise across Germany of the Nazi Party and tremendous capitulation in the church to the rise of the Reich. Hitler was working on building a coalition with churches that would define a new kind of Christianity, German Christians who would give in many ways the loyalty that belonged to Jesus to the Führer. This produced a lot of frustration amongst those deeply loyal to Jesus, and they realized something had to be done. In 1934, Karl Barth, along with a group of other scholars, put together and wrote the Barham Declaration, and this was a document of loyalty and fidelity to Jesus, a document of resistance against the failure of the German Christian church in its responsibilities in the kingdom of God. In 1935, they realized they needed to create a new training mechanism for pastors to produce a biblical faithfulness to the gospel. As they saw the leadership of the church giving way and compromising, they needed another mechanism to raise up people who would follow Jesus with faithfulness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, was tasked with building and leading a new seminary, which was to be called Finkenwald. And Finkenwald was a place for the confessing church, those who were opposed to the compromise of the German church. They gathered together daily, built on the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. They prayed, they confessed, they studied, they learned, they played. This was a community of tremendous possibility in the midst of incredible compromise. One of Bonhoeffer's friends, while he was running the seminary, who had heard him lecture years before, was deeply concerned about the intensity of the tone and tenor of what he heard about at this new seminary. So he took a train to come and visit Bonhoeffer. In the seminary, this is where his probably most known works, Life Together and Cost of Discipleship, were written. These were written as a countercultural community of discipleship in the midst of compromise. His friend comes to visit, and upon seeing the intensity of their life together, gets concerned. So he says, quote, "I was concerned about so much spiritualism in light of what was happening." Bonhoeffer takes him in a little boat, and they row across the river away from the seminary to an airfield where Hitler is amassing troops and landing planes. And they sit there in this prophetic posture between a tiny seminary of resistance and the growing weight and power of the Third Reich. And Bonhoeffer says to his friend, "Our discipline in raising faithful Christians must be stronger than the discipline of the Reich to make disciples for Nazis." We have to have a superior discipline. What we are working on in the seminary has to be stronger than what Hitler is working in the Reich. And they get back in the boat and they row back in silence. And this, to me, is an incredibly prophetic picture of the importance of the moment that we live in. We are hemorrhaging people out of the kingdom of God at the rate of 1 million young people a year. There's tremendous compromise and capitulation in the church to larger cultural forces. So how do we, with the vision that we have, build another kind of community, deeper than the deals and the ventures, a fundamental restructuring of our lives together in such a way that we can be a culture that creates an alternative future for the world? Well, I read in I read an article by Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs about the Jewish perspective on how they went about building communities of faithfulness in cultures of compromise. And he uses this phrase, a creative minority. He says this: to become a creative minority is not easy because it involves maintaining strong links with the outside world while staying true to your faith, seeking not merely to keep the sacred flame burning, but also to transform the larger society of which you are a part. This is a demanding and a risk-laden choice. So they realized they had to gather people together in these alternative communities where their life together wouldn't be complete retreat, but it would be something so strong that it could resist the forces of the culture around it, so that their community could be one of vision and hope and create a different world. So how do we in our society, based on these small historic models that pop up with a prophetic posture against the weight of culture and the possibility of God's future, what would it look like to build one of those? Well, what I'd like to do in our short time together here is just put out, just to provoke you, some of you may be familiar with this, but just by way of recap, the defining marks of what one of these creative minorities would be, so that underneath the ventures, underneath the deals, underneath the nonprofits, underneath our individual efforts would be this deeper framework of how to live together in such a way that we build alternative communities for the future. So the first thing that marks out a creative minority is an alternative commitment, accountable community over loose networks. We live in a world that loves to network, don't we? Handing out cards, LinkedIn as a way of life. But if you never have conflict in your relationships, you're not in Christian community, you're simply networking. You're simply looking to leverage what other people have for your own advantage. Sometimes if we move beyond networking, we will get to communities of preference. And these communities are ones that we stay in as long as we enjoy it. But the second it gets hard or something changes and we don't like, we'll move and shift our preferences to another community that we can choose. Sometimes people build communities on commitment, but often it looks more like contracts. These are things that we agree on together, and if we violate the contract, we're out. But there's a deeper level of commitment, and this is the one that Jesus uses to say covenantal commitment. This says that I am offering my life to you with a profound, serious loyalty, and that we will build our lives together in a common mission no matter what. Through history, there's been several examples of this. The Clapham sect, one you're familiar with, where they came together with these chief aims to transform the world. The Moravians had this covenantal commitment. And anytime you see communities organizing around covenant, not preference or networking, you see the seeds of tremendous possibility. My definition of a creative minority is this: a creative minority is a Christian community in a web of stubbornly loyal relationships, knotted together into a living network of persons who are committed to practicing the way of Jesus together for the renewal of the world. I want you to think for a moment about your relationships. You a networker? You a preference committer? How do you commit and structure your life? The way forward is through profound covenant relationships. The next thing that defines a creative minority is the story they tell in the world, a compelling alternative narrative. Babette Buster says this: narrative is our culture's currency. He who tells the best story wins. We live in a society of competing stories. There is a gospel of almost everything. And we are preaching these gospels with fundamental furor in our world today. All stories are trying to answer these questions. Why are we here? What's gone wrong? What will fix things? And what will it look like then? There's gospels of radical individualism. There's gospels of power. There's gospels of autonomy. There's gospels of sexuality. There's gospels of self-expression. But all of these things ultimately work to separate us from our Creator, exhaust us, and deform us. And so we have to have a vision of preaching the true story of the whole world, the gospel of Jesus Christ, that says we're actually here in God's story, not a self-defined story. What's gone wrong with us is not just structures or preferences, it's actually fundamentally sin. What will fix things is not our own human effort, but the good news of Jesus, and ultimately it will look like His kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. We have to make sure that we are explicitly preaching the gospel of Jesus and holding up an alternative story. N.T. Wright says this: an essential part of our theological and missional task today is to tell this story as clearly as possible and to allow it to subvert other ways of telling the story of the world. The third mark of a creative minority is not just a different kind of commitment and a different story that they're living out of, an animating narrative. It's their posture and vision of ethics in the world. Living in New York, it is pretty easy to see that the city is run on three gigantic pillars: sex, money, and power. And sometimes it's a combination, an unholy trinity of all these three functioning together. But these things originally are actually gifts from God that have been distorted. Sex is a gift from God. Money and provision is a gift from God. Power is a gift from God. And so often the church overacts and has a tremendous fear of these things. But we're actually called to provocatively steward these in an alternative way. Instead of exploitive sexuality, we practice faithfulness in our intimate relationships. Instead of a gospel of just money and mammon. We practice generosity and giving to others. And instead of using our power for ourselves to hoard and to fend off any sort of problems, we use it to serve other people in the way of Jesus. Tim Keller has an insight here that I love that talks about the way the early church did this and turned the world upside down. He says this: the early church was strikingly different from the culture around it in this way. The pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave basically nobody their money and practically everybody their body. And the Christians came along and gave practically nobody their body and they gave practically everybody their money. And I love this. I love this phrase, financial promiscuity. Financial promiscuity. Like whenever there's a need, it's like this guy cannot keep his wallet in his pants. Anytime. He's just like, let me get that, let me get that, let me get that. And I think that there is, in a world that exists to accumulate more, generosity, believing that we are stewards, has the ability to shake up the spirit of mammon. And so this becomes one of those ethical visions of how we steward these core realities of our world that shapes things as they move on. Those ethics then have to be embodied in tangible practices that move their way through our lives. This is a shared life of counterformative action. All of us are being formed deeply by our world, deeply by our world. I've lived in America for 22 years, and all I have to do is go back to Australia, and people say to me, "You've become so American." And it's very, very hard to decipher exactly what that means. But every now and then something will happen where I go, aha, I know what they're talking about. We are all being deeply shaped by the world around us. Most of these practices are not intentional in our lives. They just happen to us. We passively are shaped by them. But Jesus calls us with a different vision to counterformative practices. And that means we have to take his teaching seriously and learn to live in those as alternative disciplines that disrupt the brokenness of our world with possibility and with hope. One of my favorite examples of this is a picture taken of the cellist of Sarajevo. During the war in 1992, Sarajevo was surrounded and was being heavily bombed. It was a tremendous conflict. And there was very few places where you could access food. And there was this one little bakery in a neighborhood that people would literally line up around the block in order to be able to eat while this siege and the bombing was taking place. The bakery was struck. Several people were killed, and people just felt completely hopeless. So the principal cellist in the Sarajevo opera, dressed in his finest clothes, and moved into the brokenness. There was literally a series of holes where these bombs landed, and he sat in the middle of these holes, and he just played beautiful pieces of music as a prophetic backlash against the brokenness of the world. And this was his practice. In the midst of brokenness, I bring my art, my skill, my mastery, and I just release it into the world as an alternative practice. He did this in bombed out churches. He did this at funerals. He did this in the middle of weddings. This was a stubborn picture of hope in the middle of complete despair. People came to him and they asked and they said, "Aren't you mad for playing in the middle of a war zone?" And he said, "Aren't you mad for creating the conditions that led to this war?" Here was one man doing what God had called him to do, an alternative practice in a culture of brokenness. One theologian says this: we believe Jesus offered not hard sayings or high ideals, but concrete ways to practice God's will and be delivered from the bondage of sin. In other words, he taught his followers how to participate in God's reign. He taught what the kingdom is like, what its characteristics are, and therefore what kinds of practices are done by those who participate in it and are ready for it. We need this vision of counterformative practices. The next thing that defines a creative minority is an alternative authority. It's the lordship of Jesus without compromise. Now, as we move into our future, I know of no better community to look at in terms of living in exile than Daniel and the exiles. Daniel's an extraordinary young man. As a teenager, he was one of the brightest before they were taken into exile, and he was handpicked and brought into a position of tremendous influence and proximity to power. And you're familiar with that moment where he says, "Please just give us water and vegetables to drink." And he begins to navigate with a sense of cultural agility that is actually quite remarkable for a teenager. And he had to learn the language and literature of the Babylonians. If you've ever studied the Enuma Elish and Babylonian creation myths, you realize how anti-biblical that would have been for a young man. But instead of being seduced by it or watering down his faith or deconverting from his convictions, something strengthens within him. And as he begins to have this sense that there is really one Lord over all, and it's not Nebuchadnezzar, he begins to see his convictions strengthen. So he lives with intelligence, cultural intelligence. He lives with a sense of loyalty to the place that God's put him to serve, but he never bows the knee. And this is tested. And so first when they set up the image to worship and he says, you can throw me in the fire, that'll be fine. And then he goes through several tests. There's obviously the one with Daniel in the lion's den. Tremendous test. And then other empires rise up, and he just basically finds himself riding the waves of the power systems of the world. But he has a reference point above it all. He's not intimidated by the powers. He's not seduced by the powers because he knows where true power belongs. He has a deep internal sense of loyalty regardless of what it cost him or regardless of the outcomes. At the end of Daniel's life, when he's an old man, there's a scene which has it's marked my heart, and it's often overlooked by an angelic visitation which gets Pentecostals tremendously excited about spiritual warfare. So there's that scene where the angel shows up and says to him, Daniel, beloved of the Lord, your prayers have been answered, but I've been in a meta-level principality conflict with the prince of Persia. And he's held me up, but the day you prayed it was heard. Now people hear that and they start mapping out spiritual territory and fasting and taking on strongholds. Perhaps that's necessary, but that's not the thing that struck my heart. Here's what it says in that verse. It says, at the hour of evening sacrifice, Daniel was praying. Now here's the thing. He's been in exile almost 70 years. The temple's destroyed. There's no sacrifice. There's no priesthood. There's no artifacts. Yet in his heart, 70 years later, regardless of the power structures, regardless of the challenges, he is still ordering his heart by Jerusalem and temple time in a culture of paganism and empire. He's had an alternative loyalty that has ordered everything he does, even though he hasn't seen it for almost 70 years. That is an alternative vision of who is ruling the world. He has, if you know who is actually in charge of our story, broken the fear of man, which has controlled so much of it. When you understand authority, you realize it contains the word author, and Christians have the security that we know who is ultimately the author of our stories. It's not the next deal. It's not our company. It's not our current employer. It's not anybody. It's Jesus, who is Lord of all. And then lastly, the last mark of a creative minority is a creative contribution. It's influencing culture through redemptive participation. There's always two great temptations that will distort the mission of God. One is to completely withdraw and to not be salt and light. The other one is syncretism, where we get so in love with the spirit of the age we no longer have a provocative stance. But I think we're called to exert redemptive influence in the world. I love the word influence. It contains the word fluent, which originally has the idea of a flow from the gods through a human life. If you speak French fluently, you're not trying to speak French. You just speak French. And we forget what it's like to actually exert influence, to have a fluence in how we live. But when we live with deep integrity, when we have a different kind of covenantal community, when we have a different story that's animating our lives, when we have a different ethical vision, when we practice differently, when we have a different sense of authority, we can go about living in the security that these markers make in our lives with a sense of ease in the world, faithfully following Jesus. And I think in some sense, this brings us back to Bonhoeffer and his seminary. Bonhoeffer's seminary really was a little bit of a joke. Here he is in basically a donated sort of rundown mansion on the end of a town with a few young men trying to figure out how to live the Sermon on the Mount as a counterculture. And if you were to go back in time, say 1936, and you were to visit his little community, his little creative minority, and then you were to look at all of the might, the power, the story, the influence, the military that Hitler was amassing, and you were a betting person, who would you put your money on in 1936? Almost none of us would have put our money on Finkenwald. But look at where we are today. The cost of discipleship and life together have been a tremendous influence in the top 100 books of the last century. That vision of discipleship and a common life is still used by people today. In fact, we're at an Alternative Imagination Summit still talking about a 2-year window of faithfulness in the midst of compromise. But then look at the German church today. It's been shamed and repented for its capitulation. The Reich is in ruins. Hitler is dead, and Jesus is Lord. Who will you put your money on? You see, we are called and invited to become a creative minority. We're not called to control outcomes. Underneath all of the things we do, we are called to be this prophetic and provocative alternative society, structuring our lives in such a way that it makes the renewal of our world possible by our life together. So a creative minority is a commitment. It's a different story. It's different ethics. It's different practices. It's different authority. And it's a different creative contribution to the way of the world. So I close with a call to you, and this is a quote from what Bonhoeffer said about his seminary. He said this: "The restoration of the church must surely depend on a new kind of monasticism, which has nothing in common with the old, but a life of uncompromising discipleship, following Christ according to the Sermon on the Mount. I believe the time has come to gather people together to do this." And to that I would say, amen. Thank you.